Mr. Nadler, and the gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Spartz. Each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes a gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on S7.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of S7, which would amend the Violence Against Women Act to ensure that Native Hawaiian women can access the benefits and support included in the Critical Violence Against Women Act. According to the National Institute of Justice, more than 1.5 million American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime, while women in these communities experience significantly higher levels of sexual violence and stalking. Since its introduction in 1994, the Violence Against Women Act has provided billions of dollars of grant funding to address the needs of those who have survived domestic violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking, dating violence, and other crimes against women. One of VAWA's major grant programs, the Services Training Officers and Prosecutors Grants, commonly known as STOP grants, provides funding for eligible Native organizations to help combat sexual violence and support victims and survivors. However, due to an error in drafting language, which was first made known to Congress and the Department of Justice in 2016, Native Hawaiian organizations have been unable to access this funding to serve Native Hawaiian victims and survivors. Specifically, Native Hawaiian organizations are able to apply for STOP grant funding, but they cannot use those funds to actually serve the Native Hawaiian community. As a result of this drafting oversight, Native Hawaiian women are denied access to these critical resources, which are meant to encourage the development and improvement of effective victim advocacy and services in cases involving violent crimes against women and to strengthen services to victims. S7 would amend the Act to include specific references to Native Hawaiians and Native Hawaiian communities and organizations. This simple fix would make certain that all victims and survivors of domestic and sexual violence, including Native Hawaiian women, are able to access the services and support they need to rebuild their lives. I thank Senator Mazie Hirono for introducing this modest but important legislation. I urge all of my colleagues to support it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized.
I yield myself as such time as I may consume. Senate Bill 7, the VAWA Technical Amendment Act of 2022, makes a very small technical amendment to the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization that was signed into law in March of this year. The Violence Against Women Act provides resources to law enforcement and others to address the needs of those who have survived domestic violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking, and other crimes against women. S7 ensures that Native Hawaiian survivors will also have access to programs and resources provided under the Act. Currently, the Attorney General is directed to make violence against women grants to assist Indian tribes. This bill makes Native Hawaiian communities eligible for the same grants. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Indiana reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentlewoman from Indiana reserves.
I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized for the close.
I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Indiana yields back.
Mr. Speaker, for nearly 3 decades, the Violence Against Women Act has provided critical funding to organizations that support victims and survivors of gender-based violence. However, Native Hawaiian women who experience disproportionately high levels of sexual violence have been excluded from accessing these much-needed resources. S7 would allow Native Hawaiian victims and survivors to receive the support they need and would allow Native Hawaiian organizations to increase their efforts to combat sexual violence. I urge all my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 7? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Okay. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass S. 2991, the Countering Human Trafficking Act of 2021.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 2991, an act to establish a Department of Homeland Security Center for Countering Human Trafficking and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, and the gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Spartz, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on S. 2991.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of S. 2991, which would codify the Center for Countering Human Trafficking within the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency of the Department of Homeland Security, require the Center to develop a strategy to improve the effectiveness of its programs, and transfer the Department's National Trafficking Awareness to the Center. Trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry that exists in cities, suburbs, and rural towns and denies freedom to nearly 25 million people around the world. Although some populations are more vulnerable than others, trafficking is a constant threat to the health and safety of victims of all ages, genders, nationalities, and backgrounds, while posing a grave danger to public health and safety, as well as national and global security. In 2020, the National Human Trafficking Hotline identified more than 16,000 victims of human trafficking, who likely represent only a fraction of the total number of victims. In that same year, the Department of Homeland Security launched the Center for Countering Human Trafficking, or the CCHT, a centralized location for subject matter experts to coordinate and expand efforts to combat human trafficking. The CCHT integrates the efforts of 16 DHS offices and agencies that combat human sex trafficking and forced labor, which encompasses criminal investigations, victim assistance, identifying and reporting human trafficking, and external outreach, intelligence, and training. Since its establishment, the CCHT has made great strides, providing critical support and analysis to criminal investigators in the field, delivering comprehensive training to domestic and international audiences, and focusing on promoting an integrated victim-centered approach to the investigation of human trafficking. However, because the Center is not formally codified, it lacks permanence and long-term funding necessary to further strengthen its efforts. S. 2991 would make the CCHT permanent within ICE, ensuring that the progress made in recent years can be maintained and improved upon, while also increasing coordination among other components within DHS to fight human trafficking and prevent the importation of products made using forced labor. Excuse me. This legislation would allow the CCHT to fortify its permanent staffing with at least 45 employees that are special agents, criminal analysts, victim support specialists, and other subject matter experts dedicated to disrupting and dismantling human trafficking organizations and providing support and protection to their victims. And to promote modernization of the CCHT's information systems and operations, which support global investigations of human trafficking and forced labor in supply chains, S. 2991 would require the development of a strategy and proposal to modify systems and processes related to its mission. Lastly, this bill would transfer to the CCHT the Blue Campaign, the National Public Awareness Campaign designed to educate the public, law enforcement, and industry partners to recognize and respond to human trafficking, and authorize DHS to transfer any additional functions to the CCHT that combat human trafficking and the production of goods using forced labor. Because we know that traffickers are constantly looking for new ways to exploit new victims, we must do more to fight this grave crime. That includes being responsive to change and making necessary improvements to the agencies, offices, and components put in place to investigate, disrupt, and dismantle trafficking organizations and to give aid and support to victims. This bipartisan legislation would allow the Center for Countering Human Trafficking to continue guiding counter-human trafficking operations, protecting victims, and enhancing prevention efforts to combat human trafficking around the world. I thank Senator Gary Peters for introducing this important legislation, as well as Representative John Katko and the bipartisan coalition of colleagues who have worked on the House companion. I urge all of my colleagues to support it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, in October 2020, the Trump administration created the Center for Countering Human Trafficking, or CCHT, to consolidate all human trafficking-related DHS components into one law enforcement operations center. This bill would codify this operations center within DHS. Additionally, it would transfer the resources of the Blue Campaign to the CCHT. The Blue Campaign is a national public awareness campaign to educate the public, law enforcement, and others about the indicators of human trafficking and how to respond to potential cases. Unfortunately, the Judiciary Committee has held no hearings on the CCHT or any of the various programs it operates. We should be evaluating the requirements and consequences of any piece of legislation in the Committee of Jurisdiction before it's brought to the floor. This is common sense. Members should have an opportunity to ask important questions and offer amendments to a bill before it is brought to the floor for a vote. Unfortunately, that didn't happen here. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Indiana reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to place communications between the Judiciary Committee and the Homeland Security Committee in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 4 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, a member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
I thank the chairman of the
gentlewoman from
Judiciary
Texas
Committee,
is recognized.
Gentleman from New York, and the manager who is joining us on these bipartisan bills, which had many of them had their origins in the House. Delighted that the Senate was able to join us, and these bills come under the Senate name for the fact that we are working with the Senate on many of these similar bills in order to have them become law, because they're important. So I rise now to support S-2991, the Countering Human Trafficking Act, of the gentleman from Michigan, the senator from Michigan, who offered this legislation. And it deals with making a Center for Countering Human Trafficking permanent and require other changes to strengthen the center's contribution for the fight against human trafficking. Let me be very clear on the floor. Human trafficking is an epidemic. It's a pandemic. It's a scourge on the fabric of America. Human trafficking is one of the greatest threats to human rights in the United States. In 2020, 11,193 instances of potential human trafficking were reported to the United States National Human Trafficking Hotline, with at least 70% of these instances involving sex trafficking. The one thing about sex trafficking, it is more profitable than drugs, because you utilize, unfortunately, the tragic human being who has been made part of the bounty of your profit, and recycle them over and over again, and they're young girls and boys in many instances. I will continue to advance and support legislation like the bill before us today, as well as programming aimed at preventing human trafficking, protecting victims and survivors, as an estimated 25% of human trafficking victims are reportedly in my home state of Texas at any given time, many of whom are minors. In our state of Texas, we have developed a strong advocacy groups that fight against human trafficking, and even have done something innovative, which means that we have called our sports arenas no trafficking zones. So I rise to support this legislation with over 5,359 trafficking victims and survivors identified through a hotline in 2019. Of course, I introduced H.R. 7566, the Stop Human Trafficking in School Zones Act, now known as No Trafficking Zones, and I pronounce today on the floor, this bill must pass. We must have the Senate agree to this bill so this can be a complement to the bill that we now have on the floor. We've done hard work. We work with the Senate. We want to make sure we get this bill passed. I rise also to support the bill previously discussed, the VAWA Technical Amendment Act of 2022. I thank Senator Hirona for this courageous, important legislation to protect Native Hawaiian victims and survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sex violence, and others to have access to the vital services of VAWA, which I think are extremely important. I also rise to support S5230, Billy's Law, or the Help Find the Missing Act. This is important. I've worked with the missing and exploited children. This bipartisan legislation would fix the gaps in our nation's databases of missing persons and unidentified remains, providing much-needed closure to the thousands of families who've endured the trauma of losing someone they love. Each year, more than 600,000 Americans are reported missing, while many are ultimately found. At least 22,000 are currently missing. I know that for a fact, Mr. Speaker, because I've dealt over the last month with a family whose loved one was missing. painful, until tragically this person was found, and they were not found alive. But the pain of the missing person and not getting any response, this should be very helpful in helping to at least give comfort to families who are desperately in need of finding their loved one. So as we go forward on these legislation, I hope to continue the work that we need to do with the Senate to move forward. My final support is for S-2899, Prison Camera Reform Act of 2021. It's a bipartisan legislation that will require the Bureau of Prisons to reevaluate the security camera, land mobile radio, public address systems in the use at BOP institutions and submit to Congress a report. This is very important for civil liberties, civil rights, prison employees.
The gentlelady, an additional 1 minute.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you so very much to the chairman. The well-being of these prisoners is critical, protecting safety, well-being, civil rights, incarcerated people and prison employees, including correctional officers, medical personnel, and other staff. Let me just simply say as I close on the Bureau of Prisons, there's much work to be done. They have to do work on how they're treating women, and a recent hearing that shows that women have been abused, sexually abused in the prison, besides addressing other terrible issues, and it has included both prisoners and employees. In addition, the Prison Bureau has been known to not utilize the compassionate release. In fact, their percentages are disgraceful. And most of the prisoners have had to go outside with a lawyer. This is a law. They should use it. So I hope that as we look at improving the cameras that will provide due process to these prisoners who are incarcerated, who are paying their time, they will also have a bureau that is responsible and sensitive to their responsibilities of incarceration, but also fairness and due process. I thank my colleagues for yielding, and I ask for the support of all the legislation that I've just commented on, and particularly the underlying legislation. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, does the other side have any additional speakers? I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Indiana yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, S-2991 would not only provide permanency, increased coordination, and modernization to the Center for Countering Human Trafficking and the Department of Homeland Security, this bill would also promote growth within the center and bolster its victim-centered counter-human trafficking efforts. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 2991?